All right, well, I think we will go ahead and get started. So for those of you who don't know me, my name is Sarah Reeves, and I'm a customer support associate here at the Classic Learning Test. Here at the Classic Learning Test, we are very passionate about bringing people who are interested in the good, the true, and the beautiful together through providing meaningful assessments. And so for us, that means that most of our reading content and our grammar and writing content on the tests themselves come from our wonderful author bank. So the author bank, which you can find on our website, is a list of some of the greatest thinkers in human history. So we have people like Averroes, Augustine, we have some Jane Austen in there, wonderful classics, Sophocles, we have Plato. So just if you're looking for a new favorite author, might as well give that a shot. Some of it is a little bit headier than others, but definitely a great place to get started. So I'm going to go ahead and pass our seminar over to Dr. Siebert from Belmont Abbey College. He is the chair of the philosophy department there, and he's going to tell us a little bit more about himself and about St. Thomas Aquinas, who's one of the authors on our author bank. So thank you very much. Over to you.
Well, thank you very much for having me. Yeah, my name is Dr. Matthew Siebert, and I'm the chair of the philosophy department here at Belmont Abbey College. Let's see, I'll just tell you a little bit about myself. I grew up, actually I'm Canadian. I grew up in Manitoba in a little farming town in the Canadian prairies. And then my parents decided to be evangelical missionaries to Colombia, South America. So we went to California for a year while they studied there. And then we went to Costa Rica while they studied Spanish. And then we went to Medellin while it was the murder capital of the world. And we went to Bogota when things got a little too violent in Medellin. And then when I went back to Canada, I became a public school teacher. I've always wanted to teach. And actually, that's one of the reasons that our family wound up homeschooling, is just seeing how difficult it was, at least in that public school. And then I fell in love with philosophy, and I discovered Plato and Plato's Republic, and discovered that all of these things that I had really cared about but hadn't really been able to find reasons for were argued for in Plato, about the immortality of the soul and the importance of virtue and seeking after the source of all things. So that brought me into philosophy, and I decided to go and I did a master's degree at the University of Oxford. And then I did a PhD at the University of Toronto, which is like an Ivy League school in Canada, I guess. And I'm just very blessed to be here at Belmont Abbey College. It's really good to have good students. I just have great students, best students I've ever had. Some of them are monks, very stable and thoughtful. I have seminarians who are very eager and willing to put in the work. I have just various Christians and various people who are just interested in philosophy lovers. And we have 3 programs here. Before I can mention this again at the end, but we have 3 programs that the philosophy department is associated with. One is just a philosophy major. Another is a theology and philosophy major that's kind of the best of both, that's meant to prepare you for graduate school. And then a philosophy, politics, and economics major that's meant to prepare people to be leaders in government policy and to understand the cause and effect things about economics and statistics. But on the other hand, be able to see the big picture and define your terms and think more carefully due to philosophy, and then also know the political theory and the American situation. Okay, so I guess I should start with who is Aquinas? So here's a famous picture of Aquinas, and I would say that Aquinas was a kind of holy rebel And what I mean by this, he was a rebel as a son because he went against his family's wishes in pursuing his calling. And then he was a rebel as a scholar because at the time, in many universities, Aristotle's works were actually banned. And Augustine was, or sorry, I say Augustine instead of Augustine. That's how they say it in England. That's where I learned the most about him. Augustine was the authority. And so Aquinas came into the scene and defended Aristotle. He's kind of in the middle between, there's a rejection that you need to make of just a rationalism in which you think that reason can figure out everything, but then there's also a danger of rejecting reason itself, which is part of what people are made in the image of God with due to their reason. So he defended reason by uniting Augustine and Aristotle, kind of uniting heaven and earth, you might say. And this is depicted in a way in this famous painting that you might have seen, the School of Athens, where in the very middle you have Plato pointing upward, and the scholastics say that Plato got the heavens right. Plato understood well the immaterial world, but then Aristotle is putting his hand down. He's right about the natures of the material things. And this was definitely Aquinas's view. Yeah, and I could read maybe I should just read a very short passage saying this from Chesterton. He says, if he were speaking in Aquinas's words, he would say, I do not believe that God meant man to exercise only that peculiar, uplifted and abstracted sort of intellect, which you're so fortunate as to possess, but I believe that there is a middle field of facts, which are given by the senses to the subject matter of the reason, and that in that field, reason has a right to rule as the representative of God in man. It is true that all this is lower than the angels, but it is higher than the animals, and all the actual material objects man finds around him. So again, I would just go back to saying Aquinas is a kind of holy rebel. He feels this calling to follow God, but also he feels a calling to integrate that with his understanding that he gets from the senses, from his experience, and from philosophy. Now, a little bit of background on his life before I get into the details of it. Obviously, he's living in the Middle Ages. This is after the fall of the Roman Empire, and most of Aristotle's works were lost to the West and were preserved more by the Muslims. And the Muslims had been expanding and taking over more and more of different parts of Europe and Asia Minor. They had recently been forced out of Sicily, which is close to where Aquinas grew up. And Aquinas is also coming after a sort of 12th century Renaissance that led to the universities, to the first time that we ever have universities. And I guess this reminds me, there's a kind of myth of these barbaric Middle Ages, but I just have to quickly say, the Middle Ages were amazing. They made life so much better. There are lots of inventions from the Middle Ages that we still need and use. They invented the clock, which enables efficiency, enabled the Industrial Revolution. They discovered 3-crop rotation and double entry bookkeeping that enabled businesses to work better. They made books, like a codex was not known. Before that, there were only scrolls. Musical notation, obviously the most beautiful architecture in the world, the Romanesque architecture, and then the Gothic, and beautiful literature like rhyming poetry is first in the Middle Ages. And there were also alliterative poems. So to see samples of both of these, you could go and look at J.R.R. Tolkien's translations of Sir Orfeo and Sir Gawain and the Green Knight. They're beautiful. Feudalism was actually a really good decentralized governmental system in which the kings were not tyrants the way that later Renaissance and Enlightenment kings became. They abolished slavery, and there was much more freedom and education for women than in the ancient world or than in the Renaissance world. But anyway, I have a lot more I could say on that. But let me get back to Aquinas here. So Aquinas was raised in southern Italy, and he could see this. He could see the Abbey of Monte Cassino from his home, from his family estate, and that's where he went. He was pretty well connected. His uncle was the emperor, the German emperor. His godfather was the Pope. He studied the Trivium and the Quadrivium at this Benedictine monastery, and he was a third son. So the first two sons were meant to be soldiers, while he was being raised to be a landowner by becoming, his parents knew he had a sort of religious inclination, so they wanted him to become a Benedictine monk. And then when he would be the abbot of the Benedictine monastery, he would be like a family landowner. That was the goal. But when he went off to the University of Naples, he was idealistic. He wanted to live for a cause. He ultimately joined the Dominicans, who were a group who were, they would travel and preach, and they would beg for their food. They were mendicants. So they were beggars and scholars, two things that often go together. And his brothers, so he started walking out of Italy to go and study with the Dominicans, and his brothers captured him and brought him back home and imprisoned him in their own castle for a year. But in the end, there are various legends about it, him being let down in a basket like St. Paul to escape. In the end, he escaped somehow, and he did walk the 1,000 miles to get to Cologne in Germany, where he studied under Albert the Great. And there he got this nickname, the dumb ox. So apparently this is a nickname that his students gave him because he was just very quiet. He was a very quiet student. And one day, a student was supposed to explain a passage. He couldn't explain it. The teacher asked Aquinas to explain it, and he promptly just explained it perfectly. The students asked him all their questions. He answered all their questions perfectly. The teacher asked him a lot of questions. Albert the Great asked him all these questions. He answered them all perfectly, and Albert said, you've said he's a dumb ox, but I say that his bellowing will be heard throughout the world. And that's where we get this nickname for him of the dumb ox. That's where in Germany is where he first studied Aristotle, who he later on always referred to as the philosopher, or well, most scholastic writers refer to Aristotle as the philosopher because they see him as not always right, but the paradigm of someone who thinks through things philosophically. And after he studied in Germany, he went on to theology, to study theology at the University of Paris, which was the greatest university in the day. And the model of studying there was you study scripture first, and you do it in an apprenticeship sort of way. You first read and you hear lectures on this, and then you eventually give lectures yourself, but with the master there to listen to you, and then the master gives the final word or corrects you if you go wrong. And later in his life, Aquinas wrote many biblical commentaries on the Psalms and Job and the Gospels and the letters of Paul, and they're very insightful and definitely worth reading. He also wrote, then the next step in his education was to write a commentary on the Sentences. The Sentences was a collection of theological opinions, or sententiae, mostly from St. Augustine, but also from other church fathers, St. Gregory or St. Ambrose and so on. And they were often arranged so that they were sometimes conflicting. There would be one view on one side and another view on the other side. And then the goal of getting a master's in theology was to write a commentary that explained everything in theology by responding to, trying to explain who was right or wrong, or whether they were both right and just didn't realize it. Maybe one was thinking of human nature in one sense and not in another sense, and so on. So from that, his first great theological work was just his commentary on the sentences, but from that experience, he decided to write a textbook on theology that would explain it in a more orderly fashion, so that it wasn't just all these disputes. But nevertheless, he still wrote in a kind of debate fashion. This was one way in which medieval universities were, you might say, more open-minded or more free speech oriented than universities now. Usually you go into a classroom and you just listen to the teacher tell you stuff. There, they very frequently had debates and had people present a view. Then they expected that they would have lots of objections, and then they would respond to the objections. So when he wrote his Summa Theologiae, let's see, I don't know, I just have this version in paper, but I have another version on my computer. And it's longer than this, even though this is obviously pretty huge for these great books things. It's actually, they left out a huge section in the middle, sadly. I don't know why. His Summa Theologiae is like a textbook of theology. And then there's a much shorter version called the Compendium of Theology, and is sometimes published as Aquinas's shorter Summa by the Sophia Press. And this is a much shorter book. It's much larger print, and it very briefly summarizes his views. It's not necessarily an easy book to read, but because it helps a lot to know some Aristotelian background. But it's a compendium, or it's intentionally a very brief version of the Summa Theologiae. At the same time, he wrote the Summa Contra Gentiles, and this was meant to be a defense of Christianity against pagan philosophers. Like, there were very sophisticated Aristotelian philosophers among the Muslims, like Averroes or Avicenna are probably the most famous. Averroes or Ibn Rushd, and Avicenna, also known as Ibn Sina. And he wrote this long book to defend Christianity in response to them. And the other, so I guess three kinds of works that that Aquinas wrote. You have the Bible commentaries, you have his textbooks on theology, and a response to or defense of Christians. And then you have commentaries on Aristotle. He also commentated on different works by Aristotle to help his students out. And it was actually quite a difficult thing for him to become a master of theology, not due to his own problems, but because he got involved in what was known as a town and gown conflict. The University of Paris didn't have just its own buildings and its own location, and wasn't just under the government of Paris. It was actually under the government of the Pope more directly. And so it was like it had its own laws, and the students sometimes felt like they didn't have to always follow the laws of the town, and there was this conflict. One time the city of Paris killed a student and locked up a bunch of students, and the university went on strike as a result. But the monks just kept on teaching. They didn't care about this whole thing. They just wanted to teach their students so that their monks would keep learning and be able to go out and teach others. And so the university refused to grant Aquinas his master's degree for 4 years. While he was in Paris, Aquinas was also friends with King Louis, Saint Louis the Ninth. King Louis IX, after whom St. Louis is named. And I lived in St. Louis for 1 year when I was at the St. Louis University, and it's beautiful. They have a beautiful cathedral there. And let's see, Aquinas then, after being in Paris, he went back to Rome, and he was friends with someone who translated Aristotle's works from from the Greek or the Arabic into Latin. And Aquinas was a kind of a genius in many ways, but one striking way is that in order to write his books more quickly, he had 5 scribes writing for him at once. So in other words, he would be dictating one chapter to one scribe. He'd dictate a sentence, then he'd go to the second scribe and dictate the next sentence of the second chapter, then to the third scribe, dictate a sentence of the third chapter, to the fourth scribe, dictate a sentence of the fourth chapter, to the fifth scribe, dictate a sentence of the fifth chapter, and then go back and dictate the second sentence in the first chapter. So he somehow managed to keep all of these arguments and examples and Bible passages and everything in his head while he's doing this. It's just amazing. And I guess one more unusual thing in his life is that in those days, usually you would study at the University of Paris and then go and teach elsewhere. But he was sent back to Paris. And he was sent back to Paris by the Dominicans to help defend Aristotle from... There was kind of an anti-Aristotle feeling at the time, and there was also a pro-Aristotle but rationalist feeling at the time. In other words, there were people who felt that you had to study, that philosophy and theology were opposed to each other, and you just had to choose one or the other, or you maybe had to think philosophically on one day and theologically on the next, or yeah, he was very upset about this, and he went back and defended Aristotle and argued that Aristotle should be interpreted, especially certain passages that the Muslims understood in one way. He defended what he thought was a truer understanding of Aristotle's view of the human nature and how human nature works. And partly to also show people that this could be, that reason and faith don't have to be in opposition. If there's one saying that I would take from Aquinas, I would say it's grace perfects nature. This is maybe a key idea in Aquinas, is that grace perfects nature. In other words, the philosophers who are trying to use only reason actually have the right goals. If you read Plato's Republic, book 7, and he talks about the allegory of the cave, and he talks about going up and trying to look at the sun, which is an image of the source of everything and the goodness itself. That's an excellent goal. That is, on Aquinas' view, that's the same as the Christian goal. We want to achieve contemplation of God. We want to know God directly and see God. That's called the Beatific Vision. But the philosophers didn't know about God's friendship to us. They didn't know about God's willingness and an ability to help us. They felt like God was off in the distance and just thinking to himself about himself. And this was one thing that Aquinas disagrees with Aristotle on. I mean, it's not as if Aquinas just blindly took everything from Aristotle. He sometimes agrees with Plato rather than Aristotle, and sometimes agrees with Aristotle rather than Plato. But the key idea that I was trying to get to here is that grace perfects nature, in the sense that grace is God's help in us achieving our natural ends. We naturally have a desire for God, and our happiness ultimately consists in knowing God. So let me give you 3 key ideas from Aquinas that elaborate on this. So one idea is that God is pure being. God is being itself. God is not one of the many things like you and me that participate in being, that have some existence, have some goodness and some being, but we're not ideal. We're not perfect. We're not absolutely perfect. For Aquinas, God is absolutely perfect. And this follows from God being pure being and pure actuality. So this is a very Augustinian idea, but he proves it in an Aristotelian way. His favorite argument is an Aristotelian argument that nothing can move itself. And so there must be, nothing can actualize its own potential. We all have potential. I could potentially be in another country, or it could potentially be a different color, or it could potentially be warmer or colder. Something actualizes that. Even just existing, there was potential for me to exist, and then now I actually exist. That is not something that I could make myself do. So there must be something that actualizes that. But if we keep going back in this chain of, well, if that thing also needed to be actualized, what actualized it? We have to ultimately get back to, if we're going to explain why there is anything, we're going to have to go back to something that is just pure actuality. It doesn't need to be actualized because it doesn't have any potential to be actualized. It just is pure actuality. And that means that it is pure being. It's absolutely perfect. There's no potential for it to get better or worse. And so that means that God, on this philosophical understanding, is absolutely perfect. He's whatever it is better to be than not to be, as Augustine said. So if it's better to be loving than to not be loving, God is loving. If it's better to be understanding than not understanding, God is understanding. God has understanding, he has will, he has power, he's omnipotent, he's eternal, he's unchanging. There are so many divine attributes that follow from this, and that's what Aquinas explains in the first 25 or so, I think it's more like 28 questions of the Summa Theology. So in the first more than 100 pages. So that was one key idea. God is pure being and pure actuality. Then the second idea that I would pull out from Aquinas is that our happiness consists in contemplating God. So we do see this in the philosophers. In Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics, Book 10, he implies that happiness, the essence of happiness, is to contemplate the highest things and to contemplate God if we can, if we're capable of that. And again, what they didn't realize is that we need God's help to do that. Our intellect, so the way Aquinas puts this in the the first part of the second part of the Summa, question 3, article 8, the way he puts this is that your mind is not satisfied until you understand the essence of the causes of things. You want to know the essence of things. So if there was a thumping noise up above me, above the ceiling, I would wonder, oh, what's making that thumping noise? What's going on here? And I would want to know what it is, or in other words, I'd want to know the essence of the thing that is causing the thumping noise. Is this a squirrel? Is this a raccoon? Is this a person crawling around up there? What is going on here? And I don't just want to know that there is a cause, but I want to know the essence of that cause. So similarly, we can then apply this reasoning to just the whole universe, right? We know, we can prove, I gave an argument just now that there must be a God that causes the universe to exist, because the universe isn't the kind of thing that has to exist. And it also can't just make itself exist. So we can reason in that way to say, well, there must be a God that exists. There must be some cause of this universe. But our mind is not going to be satisfied with that. Our intellect is not going to be satisfied with just knowing that there's some cause or other. We want to know the essence of the cause. We want to We want to see God. But as Aristotle has pointed out, all of our knowledge comes from the senses. All of our knowledge we build up through our sensory experience, and then we abstract the natures of things from that. This, I think, is, just as an aside, this is probably the key point that modern people miss, and that Hume and others have been skeptical about, and that just undermines science and our belief in science, and our belief in our ability to understand the natures of things, is that they leave out the fact that we can abstract the natures of things from our sensory experience. But the problem that Aquinas notes is that that's the best we can do. We are naturally made to know material things. We aren't made to see God directly. So instead, we're made to depend on God. We need God's help. We need God's friendship, or in other words, we need charity, to be friends with God and friends with our neighbors by means of our love for God. We have to have hope that we will actually achieve this goal, that we so earnestly desire, to understand why everything is the way that it is, and to see the greatest, most perfect, most ideal goodness itself. And we also need faith. We need to believe that we will reach this goal, and we need to have right beliefs about how to achieve this goal. And so we need God to tell us things, and then we have faith in those. In other words, we trust those. My dissertation research was on faith in Augustine and Aquinas, and I would argue that we depend on faith every single day in one sense. I mean, not just the Christian sense of faith, but in the sense of trusting people. You can't really do science. You can't do all the same experiments for yourself that have been done in the last few centuries in order to build up your physics from scratch. Not each person can't do physics from scratch and then chemistry from scratch. That would just take many, many lifetimes. And you can't, when people write scientific articles, they write articles sometimes with 1,000 authors. There's no one person who wrote that article who has the experience, all of the experience that's going into that article. They have to trust each other on that. And that's an example of what you could call human faith. The scholastics would call that human faith, as opposed to the divine faith of trusting God. But sorry, my point was that we need God's help through charity, hope, and faith to be able to aim at our own happiness. So that's, I guess that was the third big idea. The first idea was God is pure being, pure actuality. The second idea is that happiness is contemplating God. And the third idea is that we actually need God's help in order to achieve this, but God is more than willing to help us. And can I throw in one more bonus idea?
Yes, please do.
Okay.
We have plenty of time, and I'm really enjoying this. So thank you.
Great. I will just say one more thing, one more thing that Aquinas is known for is his theory of natural law. Okay, and natural law, this is something that was cited, for example, by Martin Luther King Jr. in his letter from the Birmingham jail, and when he argues that the laws that are putting him in jail are not really legitimate laws. The idea in Aquinas is that there are all these regularities in nature from which we can abstract the natures of things, which I just talked about, and without which we couldn't really have a language that we can communicate about things with each other. Our words wouldn't mean the same thing to each other if they weren't referencing these natures or forms. And so humans have a nature which has certain ends. It has certain goals. We thrive best when we do what's natural for us. And you could say that the 10 Commandments are, in a sense, God's reminder to follow these rules about what's best for our nature. Like, to exist, we need to not kill each other, so don't murder. We need to keep our possessions, so don't steal. In raising children, the human race, the human nature needs to be propagated by marriage, because children are very, very vulnerable and are not going to do as well if they don't have two parents to take care of them, both a mother and a father, to take care of them and teach them how to be cooperative and how to succeed, and then to thrive. As I've just been saying, our ultimate goal is a kind of intellectual or seeing goal, be it the beatific vision. And so it's also part of our human nature and part of natural law that we ought to pursue understanding. And so you shouldn't lie to people, you shouldn't teach them falsehoods. And so there's this natural law from God that we can understand by understanding our human nature. And then human law, the laws that we make, that are made in the legislature and such, the Constitution of the United States and so on, are really legitimate only when they are applications of the natural law. When you make a rule about, say, how many years someone should go to prison for having committed a felony like murder or having stolen something, or the laws that are meant to preserve freedom of speech or preserve the integrity of colleges and teaching institutions. I guess I better stop there. So there's a lot more we could talk about, and go ahead and ask questions, and I'd love to answer any questions you have about Aquinas.
Yeah, so I guess I'll get us started with a question. For students who maybe haven't read any Aquinas, where do you think is a good place to start? Should they maybe read a bit of Aristotle for context, or dive right into the Summa?
Okay, I would say there's one book. Let me just grab it. One of the Thomists who explains Aquinas in a pretty accessible way, I think, is Edward Feser. Now, this is, unfortunately, has a taste for pretty ugly book covers, in my opinion. But this is one book that I would recommend. It's not politically correct, so I hope that doesn't offend people, but it's, and not all of, some of it, he's addressing contemporary analytic philosophers and trying to answer all of their objections, and that's near the end, and so you don't have to worry about that too much. But he has great chapters summarizing the most important things from Plato and Aristotle that Aquinas then uses, and then summarizing Aquinas's main ideas about it. And he does it in a pretty amusing and casual, understandable way.
Well, that's really exciting. I personally haven't had a great chance to read a lot of Aquinas. We read a bit of the Summa when I was an undergraduate in a political philosophy class, so talking about the natural law. But the more that I read of philosophy, the more I want to just read his portions about God and theology, because his elaborations on Aristotle are mind-blowing, I think one could say.
Yeah. He is a very clear writer. I think he's a very clear writer. You can follow, every one of his articles is a beautiful essay of its own, and it's very good style, and you can learn how to write well from reading him. But he does assume a lot of Aristotle. So I guess the other book, if you want to get into him, as I mentioned, you could read this or another version of the Compendium of Theology. And I think it's also on this website that I mentioned. Oh, I didn't show that, but I can show that, I guess, in a moment here.
That'd be wonderful.
There's this website where you can read almost all of Aquinas's works in either Latin or English or both, whatever you want.
Oh, wonderful. Well, that's a great resource.
Here's the compendium down here. Yeah.
Oh, lovely. Saved me a bit on my book budget, right? Yeah. So I was wondering if we could switch gears just a little bit and hear more about the philosophy program and the honors college at Belmont Abbey. I know just a little bit about your summer program, and I'd also love to hear more about that if you can touch on it.
Right. Okay. So there is this. Let me just show the website for that too. There's this Schola summer program that is an introduction to the way that we do great books here at Belmont Abbey College. The primary way we do great books here is through this honors college. And the philosophy faculty teach some of the courses in that, but faculty from different departments teach courses in this. And then there are some who are just dedicated to the honors college itself. And there are some amazing people who run this summer program. They have lots of fun and get really deep, really fast into some great philosophy and literature and political thought and all kinds of things. I personally have not actually taught in the Schola, but I know a bunch of people who have, and they said it was really great. So I definitely recommend that, looking into that. I think it's a great value, I don't know if it even, unfortunately, I'm not a details person, and I don't run the honors college, so I don't know whether it costs anything or whether it's, I think it does cost something, but it's not very much.
Yeah, so I saw on the website that it costs, I think it's $575 for the in-person event, and then it's completely free to join the virtual event,
Right,
which is absolutely fantastic, maybe for students who aren't close to North Carolina, and that would be a bit difficult for them to travel. So that's really wonderful. But you mentioned some different philosophy and philosophy, politics, and economics programs. What do you teach in?
Right. So in the philosophy program, so I guess I'll just show you this page 2 from philosophy if people can see that. Okay. Let's see here. Sorry, I'm moving too fast here. In philosophy, so the program is a fairly Thomistic program, and we read a lot of Aristotle, we read a lot of Aquinas, we do the different subjects like epistemology, metaphysics, but we do them in a great books way. And so in my metaphysics class, for example, we start off by reading Plato's Phaedo, and talking about the forms. We read Aristotle's physics a little bit. Then we read Aristotle's metaphysics. Then we read some of Aquinas, his On Being and Essence. And we also read, we need to be able to respond to the modern thinkers. So we also read some David Hume and John Locke, and even maybe some Derek Parfit, like some very, very recent people who are writing on what is the nature of a person and personal identity. So that's just an example. So the courses are also laid out in a kind of Thomistic progression, the way that he thought you should learn things. We start off with studying what is nature, and then human nature, and then ethics, and then epistemology, and finally metaphysics. I feel like I'm missing something in there, but and then at the end you would write a thesis, and I teach this thesis course, and also give people all kinds of practical advice about possibly going to graduate school, or maybe not, or just becoming good at doing research and thinking things through carefully. So that's the one. We've got the philosophy program, but then we also have, where is it? We also have a theology and philosophy program, as I mentioned, in which you can see here we kind of hit all the greatest hits in philosophy and in theology in order to prepare people for going off to graduate school and studying either theology or philosophy or religious studies or other things that just require some background. I know a lot of people take philosophy as a preparation for going to law, or even entrepreneur. I've heard people who are leaders of entrepreneurial schools saying that you definitely have to study philosophy if you're going to become an entrepreneur, because it helps you to think big picture, think about human needs, think about human nature, and think outside of the normal. So there's that theology and philosophy program. And then the other program that we started recently started a few years ago. It's the first philosophy, politics, and economics degree in Western North Carolina. There is one at Duke and UNC, but we started the first one over here. And this was a program that philosophy, politics, and economics, the idea of joining these together was started at Oxford about 100 years ago. And many politicians, government workers, policymakers have taken this kind of degree. And the idea is, as I said near the beginning, is to unite the economics of the sort of day-to-day statistics and cause and effect, the philosophy, on the other hand, of the big picture, human nature, understanding our final goal, ethics, how to do all these things in an ethical way, and then the politics of what is our political system, how does it work, what are the political ideals we live with, and what kind of things are practical and possible in our political arena today. So that's a really great program, and we've got a lot of interest, especially from the Honors College students, the ones who are coming here to do their great books education. It's a unique great books program we have here, because you can do great books in order to meet your core requirements and do a kind of minor in great books. But then you can also, if you want to, I mean, you can either just do a whole major in great books and just only read the great books, which is great, or you can take a more normal, I guess, major in some other thing. If you're really worried that great books won't help you feed your children, then you can take accounting or something. Or you can take this philosophy, politics, and economics course of study. And it fits really well with the honors courses, because some of the honors courses are already geared towards politics, or a lot of them are very philosophical, and one of them is about economics. And so honors students really like this program and have been signing up, and we have some really amazing philosophy, politics, and economics students who are super sharp, and I think will be great leaders in the future.
That sounds absolutely incredible. Man, I wish I was an undergrad so I could come join this program. But so thinking about students who are maybe interested in the Honors College or philosophy at Belmont Abbey, what type of student do you find thrives as a learner with y'all?
Oh, I mean, just someone who really wants to learn and really wants to ask questions. Ask me tough questions. Ask me all your tough questions, please. Someone who is somewhat in tune with these great books and with just the general intellectual heritage that we have as here in the West, that has grown up, the civilization that we have that has achieved so many amazing things, the rule of law and universities and education and so on. I guess, I mean, we are a Christian college, and something like, I guess about half of our students are Catholic, I think. And so obviously it's a Catholic college, it's a Benedictine college. So if you are attracted to that, if you like the fact that Mass is available each day, if you like to see monks and talk with them and ask them how their life goes, if you like to talk about angels in your philosophy class and talk about science in your theology class, then this is the kind of place where you'll wind up doing that sort of thing. And I know that there are lots. I have all kinds of students, and some of them just are here because there are a lot of sports programs that are attractive to some, And then there are some really great programs we have in psychology and business education. And now we just started a nursing program. So it's the kind of place where you can get a kind of professional or practical education alongside of a great books education, if that's what you want as well. Yeah.
That's wonderful. So speaking of students who ask difficult questions, we have a wonderful question in the Q&A from Abbey. Abbey asks, is happiness defined only as the achievement of rational beings' ultimate end, an act of will or an act of intellect? Why? What's the difference and why does it matter? My goodness, that's a very good question. So
yeah, great question.
I'm glad we have a couple of minutes left because this will take a while to go through.
This is a great question. This was a big debate in Aquinas' time, and after his time, there was a debate between the Dominicans and the Franciscans, the Franciscans tended to emphasize free will and the freedom of the will over the intellect, whereas Aquinas and the Dominicans tended to emphasize the primacy of the intellect. The goal, as Plato says, the thing that will satisfy you is what most fulfills your nature. And we're ultimately rational animals. And so understanding, I think, is the primary goal that your will is aiming at. So the will, how can I put it? The will aims at the good, the intellect aims at the true. The good, the ultimate good that the will is aiming at is that your intellect would achieve an understanding of what is true and ultimately the beatific vision and understanding God. So I would say that the intellect is higher in this regard, and the will is directing us to fulfill our intellect. At the same time, it's the will that loves and enjoys. And if we just think about intellect and how we're made to understand material things, in that way, the intellect is lower than the will, because the will can aim all the way up to God. But ultimately, I would say the intellect is more noble, as the scholastics would say, than the will, because it's what leads, it's what the will is drawing us toward, is understanding. Now I can't remember if I answered all of those questions. It was a bit of a complicated question, but I hope I did.
That was wonderful.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. So I think I would find it helpful just if you went over your I guess 3 and a bonus points about Aquinas before we say goodbye for the evening, just so that students have that fresh in their mind as they leave.
Sure. Yeah. So the first was God is pure being or pure actuality, which then implies that God is perfect, and implies all of from just a philosophical argument, you can then show that God has all these attributes that we attribute to God of perfection, omnipotence, being perfectly good, being perfectly loving, and so on. The second idea was our happiness then is in contemplating God, in understanding God. If God is absolutely perfect, then God is also goodness itself. So God is not just pure being, God is pure goodness. And that is what we most want to possess, and as much as we can, and by understanding it and reveling in it, that's our goal. That's what makes us happy. And the third point was that we do need God's help to achieve these. This is the main difference, I guess, between just some philosopher and Aquinas the theologian, that we need friendship with God, or in other words, charity. We need hope that we can achieve this happiness, and we need faith in order to believe that we can achieve the happiness and to know how we can achieve that happiness.
Wonderful.
The fourth was natural law. Yeah, right. The fourth was natural law, that there are ways in which we thrive as humans, and the goal of law is to set down by means of reason the ways, the application of more general principles about how humans thrive to a particular country or particular municipality, particular state. I'll put it that way.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much for presenting for us, Dr. Siebert. I really enjoyed it, and I'm sure everyone else did as well. Before we leave, I would just encourage everyone who joined us to take a look at Belmont Abbey College, specifically their summer program. Go ahead and register. It looks absolutely phenomenal. You get to read great books and explore Charlotte, North Carolina area. So definitely go ahead and give that a look. And thank you so much for joining us. We'll continue to have Journey Through the Author Bank seminars going forward with professors from other partner colleges, and we would love to see you all there. Have a great evening. Bye.
Thank you. You too. Bye.